Hello and welcome to the third class of our study, our foray into the book of Revelation, subtitled Apocalypse as Hope. If you have watched the first two videos or were with us in person for those classes, you'll know that in our first week, we did an overview of our own individual stories or interactions with the book of Revelation, sort of placing it within the context of our times and within pop culture. We'll do more of that later in later lessons. And then last week, we talked about the genre of the book itself, which is apocalyptic literature, more specifically Hebrew apocalyptic literature. And we studied some of its development and where the book of Revelation fits on the timeline of the development of this unique genre of literature that we no longer have with us. This week, we are going to talk about the writer himself, John, as he names himself in the book, and that's really all we have to go on. More on that in a second. I will also, just for fun, call your attention to this photo that I found, this painting of John the Revelator on Patmos. Um, this is a medieval painting, and you can see he's holding a bound book. Um, that's quite anachronistic. And what the bird has to do with it, I'm not sure. Those are my comments. Let's move on. Class 3, The Origins of Revelation. Brief review. Hebrew prophetic writing developed as a genre during the occupation of Israel by the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians during the years 750 through 350 BCE. These works were dire analysis of the status quo and the way things were, and then leading to calls to repentance. And sometimes, more and more often as the time would go forward, they would allude to a possible bright future and a new age that would come by God's grace and by God's workings on the other side of the current evil age that they found themselves in, an age dominated by violence and exploitation by the various empires that subjugated the peoples. Out of that came apocalyptic literature, which developed out of the prophetic writing traditions in the centuries leading up to the life of Jesus and for about 100 years thereafter. Last week we studied one that was written in the Middle Ages that is more of an anomaly. The writing of the books that would be found in the Christian canon, this one, and the Jewish canon, books like Daniel and some of the apocryphal books that we don't study ourselves, they would be written around the time of Jesus and the century before and the century after. And those kind of writings will more or less dry up, as I think the Christians sort of made it weird. But these writings were about cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil. They had very little moral ambiguity. There were clear categories of right and wrong. God will bring about a new age from the top down. And often this new age would be brought in by a messianic figure, or Christos. Christos is a Greek rendering of the word Messiah. And we call Jesus the Christ, directly out of this line of thinking. To call him the Christ is to allude to the genre of literature that we're talking about, that assumed sometimes a messianic figure as the catalyst to bring about the changes that needed to happen in the midst of exploitation and empire. These works of Jewish apocalyptic literature, and then the one we're studying today, which is Christian / Jewish apocalyptic literature, use metaphor, symbolism, and over-the-top fantastical visions to describe the status quo, the pending cosmic battle, and the final conclusion. And here off to your right, you see an image from depicting a scene out of the book of Daniel with various different kinds of beasts, the different beasts with different kind of body parts. Like you see a lion with wings like an angel, a multi-headed leopard with wings back there. And all of these symbolized different forces, active and present in his time, on the move, on the prowl, as it were, seeking to devour. And they come from the sea, the place of chaos. Jesus, tapping into this line, would speak in apocalyptic terms, and there are several speeches that he gives in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke specifically that allude to his familiarity with apocalyptic literature and his adoption of that worldview. But there was a twist. he claimed to be the Christ, the messianic agent that would bring about the new age, and that it was happening in real time around him. Or as he said in Luke chapter 17, the realm of God is in your midst. He brings it with him. And Christians continue to believe that we live somewhere in that in between, as we are still in anticipation of a new age, a world with better values and reflecting greater beauty than the one that we now inhabit. Tonight, we're going to consider these three questions. Who wrote the book of Revelation? In what context was it written? And then, what issues did John write to address? Who wrote it? What was the context? And what were the issues addressed by this work? So to the first question, let's get right to it. Who wrote Revelation? John. Well, someone named John probably did. And that's about all we know. There are no other biographical details given in the text. Within the first century of its composition, the fact we knew little about Revelation's author seems to have been generally accepted. But in time, lore developed surrounding its writing. People began to speculate if one of the Johns mentioned in the scriptures could be the author. An obvious candidate for its writing could be the disciple, Apostle John, son of Zebedee. Problem is, at the time of Revelation's writing, John, son of Zebedee, would be about 90 years old, and what's he doing out on Patmos anyway? But perhaps the most telling evidence to suggest that John of Zebedee did not write Revelation is that its author makes no claims to be an apostle, disciple, or to even have met Jesus, save in the vision that he wrote down. That would be odd. You can think of the way that the Gospels and letters go. If the writer of a gospel, say their name was Mark, wrote it, they would want you to know what their connection was with Jesus, who they were. And often it was a disciple, or in the case of the Apostle Paul, an apostle who claimed to have met Jesus on Damascus Road. You get none of those qualifiers in the book of Revelation. The only place where this writer seems to have met Jesus is in this vision, at least if we're only going off of the text. Now, there is a chance that Revelation was written pseudonymously, as many other apocalyptic works were, just putting this name John on there. John was a very, very common name. It's like some of our names today. Well, John is still that way today for us. Tom, Bob. You know, if somebody writes that their name is that, it's almost nondescript, common name at the time. So scholars, while we don't know, say it's pretty likely that this person was named John. Why not? But even if it were written pseudonymously, if I'm saying that right, that would not be a scandal. People did that all of the time. Attach the name of an important personage or a name that sort of helped them blend in, whichever they desired, onto a work. And this was accepted by the readers. It wasn't like today where we would maybe wonder more about it or even create a scandal around who was the author. That wasn't the way of the times when this was written. And so if John were ascribing himself that name for this work, that would not have been scandalous in the slightest. But in the end, what do we know? It was probably written by a man named John. All that to say this. Probably written by a man named John. He wrote the letter from the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea. More on that in a moment. And he was most likely a Jewish Christian. We believe that he had Jewish roots because of his familiarity with the Hebrew Bible. He seems to be able to pull from the Jewish canon quite easily, as he employs certain imagery or texts from the Hebrew Bible. And he has a very odd command of the Greek language, is another clue into maybe this is not his primary language. His Greek is unique in and of itself. There is not another kind of Greek writing that reads like the Apocalypse of John, or this book of Revelation. More on that, more on John's Greek. It contains the most peculiar Greek in the entire New Testament. As I was saying, there's nothing else like it anywhere, not even in other Greek writings outside of the Bible. John consistently breaks the rules of Greek grammar. He writes in slang and in ways that come off odd. Much of it is difficult to translate into English in a way that is sensible, but that also maintains the integrity of the text's intended meaning. And you have to imagine it probably read that way in the original Greek too. Like, why is this guy writing in such an odd way? But take this as an example from Revelation chapter 1, verse 4, which we read in our Bible translation into English. John, to the seven churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come. Grace to you and peace from he the is, and from he the was, and from he the coming one. That second line that I read is just a repetition of what I read in our Common English translation from the New Revised Standard Version. But if you were to write it in exact literal English to one for one to the Greek, it would read like that: grace to you and peace from he the is, from he the was, and from he the coming one. And yes, it sounds as strange to the Greek speaker in the Greek as its more accurate English translation does to us. And so what gives? This piques the interests of the Bible scholar. Well, there are two theories, either one plausible. One, perhaps his poor or strange Greek is the result of Hebrew being his primary language. Or perhaps he's breaking the grammatical rules on purpose, like a rebellious schoolchild using slang as a form of rebellion to make special points. And Bible scholars debate both of these, and also I would add they're not mutually exclusive. It could be a little bit of both. Now to the context in which John wrote. Most Bible scholars believe that John wrote Revelation around the year 95 Common Era, during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. Some seem to believe today that John had 21st century Christians in mind when he wrote it, but this was not the case. He was writing to Christians spread out throughout Asia Minor during a time of great anxiety for some of them. Emphasis on some of them. Not everyone was living in quite the precarious way that John's audience likely was, because while some Christians were sorely persecuted and killed during this time, many others found ways of assimilating well into Roman culture. This would be an issue for John. You can see his words to the church of Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3. We'll be studying that chapter next week. The letter is addressed to 7 churches spread throughout Asia Minor. These are cities that have been taken by the Romans and are now fully assimilated into Rome's cultural life. As such, they have compromised their values. And one other detail about this man, John, is he was banished to Patmos. Now, similar to how there are legends as to Revelation's authorship, there are also legends about the location of this writing, the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea. This is just off the coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. There is one legend that assumes John, the apostle, wrote Revelation, but was first boiled in oil, survived, and then was sent to Patmos to waste away working the mines. That little anecdote comes from Tertullian, writing around the year 200 Common Era, a full century after Revelation's composition. Problem is, there is no historical evidence of this. Also, describing John's time on Patmos as arduous is probably also incorrect. Here's what's likely the case. A Christian dissident named John was teaching a message that made Roman officials uneasy. So they banished him to an island like so many other political dissidents. There they were expected to find some way to provide for themselves and could otherwise live well so long as they didn't leave the island. Life on Patmos would not have been too bad. Patmos had a harbor, a fort, and even an athletic organization. Here on this picture to your right, you can see the fort that is left there. Patmos had a harbor. I already read that. Inscriptions found by archaeologists tell us that they held banquets and temples and had temples to God. And there were no mines. So this idea of him working the mines is just patently false. There are no mines. The only thing odd or different about this island, from our vantage point, was John. Just an island in the Aegean Sea. Not especially a bad place to be. Not the best, just a place. Now, there's the context. What were the issues faced and addressed in Revelation? Well, there was the issue of persecution of the Christians, the assimilation of some of them, and complacency that was all too prevalent. Let's start with persecution. And here I included the picture of John allegedly being boiled in oil. As we'll proceed through this, we'll read that this scene here is too dramatic. It's not like what the sort of persecution that we would have in mind wasn't quite so polished, I would say. They didn't have this very large, big bowl designated to the purpose with something like a gallows to lift him in, and this show of Roman soldiers there. That's a bit much compared to what we actually know went down. Well, let me get to it. Perhaps the scenes of cosmic conflict described in Revelation resonated with some of John's audience because they fully understood that there were violent forces unleashed in the world. Sometimes this violence would take form of state-sanctioned persecution against Jews and Christians. An impression of persecution that developed centuries later imagined this as a time of massive, nationwide, and organized persecution of Christians en masse. Modern scholarship has called into question the scale of persecution during Domitian's reign. We do not find evidence of Christians tortured and killed en masse during this time. Rather, persecution was local and from the bottom up. A report from a local would be handed on up to governing officials who would decide what to do on a situation-by-situation basis. And fortunately for historians and for us today, we have an actual example of this happening. And here is an excerpt from pbs.org writing about this occurrence. Quoting, "In the year 112, Pliny the Younger was faced with a dilemma. He was the governor in the Roman province of Bithynia, modern-day Turkey, when a number of Christians were brought into his court. It is unclear what the initial charges are, but he ultimately decided, despite the fact that the Christians seemed generally harmless to him, that he should execute them if they refused to recant their faith. Because he is unsure as to whether he can kill them legally for no other crime than their faith, he writes to his friend, the emperor, for advice. The emperor replies that he did the right thing in executing them, but advises him not to seek out Christians for persecution." So in this anecdote, we see, yes, persecuted, but in this case, you see the emperor advising caution. And this is the Emperor Trajan, who is known for persecuting Christians, but it wasn't kill them all. It was, hey, use some discretion. Now, in the midst of sometimes persecution, definitely persecution you would have heard of in the province. You would be aware of some places where Christians had it worse. There was the problem of assimilation into which John was writing. So imagine that you've become a Christian in a Roman province in the first century, and let's imagine that you don't have any nosy neighbors. In fact, when your neighbors discover that you are a Christian, they don't really care. What business is it of theirs? And besides, people are used to a diverse panoply of gods and goddesses to choose from, Rome being a polytheistic society. But then comes the great feast, the cultural event of the year. You've attended it every year since you've been born. Your city turns out in full and welcomes in tourists from the surrounding countryside. Your friend turns to you and asks you if you are going. Problem is, the feast is in honor of the goddess Artemis. Now you don't believe in Artemis, but you are unsure if it would be appropriate to eat meat sacrificed to her or any other deity for that matter. How if you are expected to offer a sacrifice to the goddess yourself or offer a prayer? What would you do? Quoting from Brian Blunt, a commentator on Revelation, from his book just called Revelation, pages 8 and 9. In Roman-occupied Asia Minor, in the last decade of the first century, during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, there existed a strong motivation to accommodate. In Rome's ideological infrastructure, religion and politics were quite intentionally mixed. Worship often mutated into politics. Politics was often exercised through religion. Worship of Roman deities not only demonstrated a cultic devotion and communal piety, it also signaled loyalty to the Roman state, which was mythologically connected to and practically founded upon them. It is not surprising, then, that the mother goddess would savor the name Roma, or that the messianic hopes for the empire should be bound up in the person of the emperor. This blessing of politics and worship was especially evident in Asia Minor, where John and his 7 churches were located. There, particularly during the last decade of the first century, emperor worship flourished. And again, quoting Blunt from page 12 of his book, answers to this dilemma varied from church to church. province to province, individual to individual. Some refused to accommodate and faced little consequences. Others faced great consequences. Still others found a middle way, a way to remain in that society and fit in. The Asia Minor Christians were passing themselves off as every other emperor worshipping meat sacrificed to pagan gods eating Greco-Romans. And with the problem of assimilation came the problem of complacency. While some Christians suffered great persecution during Roman rule, and others struggled to find the balance between accommodation and holding fast to faith, still other Christians thrived under Roman rule. John addressed Revelation to one church in chapter 3, Laodicea, and of this church he writes, "For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, I need nothing. You do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked." And here John is writing of the values that matter in the realm of God, spiritual virtues, over and against sometimes in conflict with our material comforts. And this is a scathing review of one church that had become complacent, one we'll read about again next week. Christians who thrived under Roman occupation had to find a way to reconcile themselves to the suffering caused by the Roman Empire. Some, like the Christians in Laodicea, felt that their material wealth may even be a sign of God's favor. But John believed that such Christians who have become comfortable and complacent in the security brought on by material wealth have in fact lost faith. Or as Craig Koester summarizes in the Great Courses lectures on Revelation, they are wealthy economically, but the material comfort has zapped the vitality of their faith. I'm reminded now of the various individuals we meet in the Gospels who seem to have the same issue: tax collectors and others profiting by way of an economic system that hurts, harms, and even leads to the deaths of many others. And we today in our own time can find our own equivalents, people working in places or surviving in ecosystems, economic ecosystems that cause harm and yet sometimes profit ourselves. So to summarize, John is writing to Christians throughout Asia Minor, that's modern Turkey. Some were persecuted, some were thriving, while most were somewhere in between. How they would receive this letter would depend on their social standing. To the persecuted, the visions of Revelation should remind them that life will win out. If you keep reading, life does win out. There is hope for a future. God will do this, so they should try and endure faithfully to the end. To the assimilators, the visions of Revelation may act as a challenge to the stark dichotomies, good versus evil, light versus dark, etc., forcing them to make a choice. No more accommodating. In the meantime, up your commitment to Jesus the Christ and the ways of the realm of God. And then to the complacent or the comfortable, the visions of Revelation call them to open up their eyes, where before prosperity made them oblivious to the rot at the heart of the Roman Empire and its economic system. Those are the three sorts of individuals that John has in mind in the writing of this book. And we'll conclude with a bit of a thought experiment. I've made the case by now that the book of Revelation is not a fortune-telling book, providing us a timeline for the end of the world. Rather, it was written in a specific time and context, and in specific the Roman Empire. It pulls from stories past to describe the cyclical nature of history and the patterns of empire going back to the Egyptians and Assyrians. The patterns repeat, and the reader is invited to learn and to disengage from the destructive practices of empire. All this said, what are modern readers to make of it? We may recognize the patterns on repeat yet again and determine for ourselves, where do we fit in? Are we among the persecuted? If not, why not? Are our ways so accommodating to the ways of empire that we are not a threat to it? Have we as individuals in our own time found ways to assimilate to a culture of death? And what might this say about us? In future weeks, we will uncover John the Revelator's answer. Spoiler alert, those who cannot extricate themselves from beastly ways of empire die with the beast. Now, allowing for some parallels between John's context and ours, where do we fit? And here's the thought experiment. Where do we fit? I can give you my own answer with a great degree of fear, trepidation, and humility. I've been an assimilator, and at times all too comfortable. If you have any questions and you're watching this video, please write in to me. Here is my email, heath@ndncc.org. I'd love to hear from you. Here is the coming schedule. You'll see next week we are going over the 7 churches, Revelation chapters 1 through 3, and we'll be going through that text itself in detail, bringing to life much of what is written there. As I just said, that class is on May the 19th. It's a week from today at the Northwood Library at 6:30. If you're familiar with our church, we're Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. That's 6:30 p.m., I should say. And we'd love to have you in person. If not, continue to watch these videos. And if you would like to subscribe to the channel or like the video, that should get it out there a little more, a little way of promoting it. If not, or in any case, I'll see you next week where we'll cover Revelation chapters 1 through 3, which is about the 7 churches to which this writing is addressed. Here, I will leave on the screen for a few seconds for you to take a screenshot or write down perhaps some of the sources that you might want to consult for yourselves. These are the books that I read through to put together these lessons. I've got one more page here. I will commend to you that Great Courses lecture series by Craig R. Koester. It's 24 lectures on the book of Revelation, each one about 25, 30 minutes long. He's a college professor, wrote one of the books that I consulted, and you can find that at the library here in Indianapolis. I had no trouble finding it at the library and checking it out for an extended period of time if you want to do more of your own research. Okay, and that does it for today. And maybe I'll see you later this evening when we go over this lesson in person. God bless.